Moscow, January 1948. A factory foreman named Dmitry walks into his local Sberbank branch with a passbook showing 18,000 rubles. He's been depositing since 1938. 10 years of night shifts, rationed meals, and mandatory wartime bonds. All of it recorded in that small gray booklet. He's not wealthy. He's careful. He did exactly what the Soviet state told every loyal worker to do: save through official channels, trust the institution, build for the future. The teller slides a new passbook across the counter. It shows 1,800 rubles. No explanation is posted on the walls. No government official has visited his factory to discuss it. A currency reform announced 6 days earlier. Decree number 3080, signed by Stalin, has simply redenominated Soviet savings at a ratio of 10 old rubles to 1 new ruble. Accounts over 3,000 rubles were hit hardest. The people with the most disciplined savings lost the largest share. Dmitry walks out with 10% of what he walked in with. He did everything right. That was never the point. What happened to Dmitry wasn't an accident of poor monetary policy. It wasn't collateral damage from wartime spending. It was the deliberate, engineered terminal phase of a savings confiscation mechanism the Soviet state had been running, in different forms, since 1917. The USSR didn't collapse and then steal its citizens' savings. It stole its citizens' savings as a structural feature of how it operated. Across 7 decades, 3 distinct mechanisms transferred private wealth into state hands so efficiently, so quietly, that most of the people it happened to didn't have a word for what had been done to them. This is an autopsy of those mechanisms, and the reason it matters today has nothing to do with communism. Mechanism 1. The currency reform trap. The 1947 reform wasn't the first. The Soviets had run the same play in 1922, converting war-era rubles at ratios that wiped out anyone who had saved in the old currency. They ran it again in 1961 when Khrushchev redenominated at 10-1 across the board. A cleaner ratio than 1947, but the effect on long-term savers was identical. Decades of accumulated rubles repriced overnight. The mechanism worked because Soviet citizens had nowhere else to put their money. Private banks didn't exist. Foreign currency accounts were illegal and punishable by imprisonment under Article 88 of the Soviet Criminal Code. Gold ownership was restricted. The Sberbank, Sberbank Bank, literally savings bank, was not a bank in any meaningful sense. It was a state deposit collection instrument. The interest it paid was set by the same government that could redenominate the balance at will. When your savings exist inside a system where the counterparty also controls the unit of account, a currency reform isn't a financial event. It's a confiscation with paperwork. That figure, 10 old rubles for 1 new, should terrify you. Not because it happened in the USSR, because the mechanism requires nothing more exotic than a government that controls both the currency and the institution holding your savings. Mechanism 2. Forced collectivization and the destruction of productive assets. The 1947 currency reform targeted urban workers. The collectivization campaign of 1929 to 1933 targeted a different kind of savings entirely: the accumulated productive wealth of the Soviet peasantry. Before collectivization, roughly 25 million peasant households in the USSR operated small private farms. These weren't large estates. They were subsistence operations with marginal surpluses. A few animals, a stored grain reserve, a plot of land that had been worked for generations. In the context of a rural economy with no banking system, this was savings. It was the stored value of labor, expressed in livestock and land rather than currency. Between 1929 and 1933, the Soviet state seized approximately 97% of agricultural land and consolidated it into collective farms, according to R.W. Davies and Stephen Wheatcroft's research in The Years of Hunger, published by Palgrave Macmillan in 2004. Livestock holdings were seized or slaughtered. Cattle numbers fell by roughly half between 1929 and 1933, according to Soviet agricultural census data cited in the same work. Grain reserves were confiscated as production quotas. The peasants who resisted, the so-called kulaks, were deported to labor camps or executed. An estimated 5 to 7 million people died in the resulting famine of 1932 to 1933, concentrated in Ukraine, Kazakhstan, and the North Caucasus. This isn't a historical curiosity. This is the playbook. The systematic conversion of privately held productive assets into state-controlled instruments, executed under the cover of ideological necessity. The mechanism didn't require a currency reform. It required redefining what ownership meant. One decree and the asset class that had stored 3 generations of peasant labor simply ceased to be private property. Mechanism 3. The Sberbank freeze of 1991. The final act came at the end, and it was almost elegant in its simplicity. By 1991, the Soviet Union was in terminal economic crisis. Inflation was accelerating, shortages were endemic, and the ruble was losing purchasing power faster than the state could manage. Soviet citizens held an estimated 369 billion rubles in Sberbank accounts, according to research published by the Russian Institute for Economic Research. This represented the life savings of roughly 70 million depositors, the accumulated balances of people who had survived the 1947 reform, survived collectivization, and continued to save through official channels because there was no alternative. In January 1992, following the dissolution of the USSR, the Russian government under Yeltsin liberalized prices, removing Soviet-era price controls that had kept consumer goods artificially cheap. Inflation ran at approximately 2,500% that year, according to Russian Federal State Statistics Service historical data. The 369 billion rubles in Sberbank accounts, savings that had taken lifetimes to accumulate, lost roughly 96% of their real purchasing power within 18 months. No decree was required this time. No redenomination order. The savings weren't confiscated. They were simply made worthless by the removal of the price controls that had given the ruble its artificial stability. The mechanism was different. The outcome was identical. Dmitri's grandson, who had inherited a Sberbank passbook showing 30 years of deposits, watched it become enough to buy a few weeks of groceries. That's the historical record. Now here's why it matters today. The mechanism, not the ideology. The Soviet case is not a story about communism. Strip the ideology out entirely, and what remains is a structural pattern that has appeared in every major currency collapse of the 20th century. A population with savings concentrated inside state-adjacent institutions, denominated in a currency controlled by the same entity managing the crisis. Argentina, 2001. Weimar Germany, 1923. Zimbabwe, 2008. Lebanon, 2019. The specific political system varied. The mechanism was the same. When a state needs to close a fiscal gap and its citizens' savings are accessible, held in regulated institutions denominated in the state's own currency. The path of least resistance is to reach into those institutions. It doesn't require malice. It doesn't require a totalitarian government. It requires a large enough fiscal problem and a population with no institutional alternative. Carmen Reinhart and Kenneth Rogoff in This Time is Different, Princeton University Press, 2009, cataloged 66 instances of forced currency conversion or deposit restructuring since 1800 across democracies, authoritarian regimes, and everything in between. The Soviet Union appears in that data. So does the United States during the 1933 gold confiscation under Executive Order 6102, when private gold holdings above 5 troy ounces were made illegal, and citizens were required to exchange them for paper dollars at a fixed government rate. The mechanism doesn't have a nationality. It has a condition: savings concentrated in instruments where the counterparty controls the terms. The diagnostic question. The action layer here is not a withdrawal instruction. It's a question about counterparty architecture. Every savings instrument you hold has a counterparty, an institution or government whose continued willingness to honor the contract determines what you actually own. A Sberbank passbook in 1947 had a counterparty, the Soviet state. A peso savings account in 2001 had a counterparty, the Argentine government. The Soviet Peasants' Grain Reserve had a counterparty after 1929, the collective farm system. The question is not whether your counterparty is currently trustworthy. It's whether your counterparty has the structural ability to change the terms unilaterally and what conditions would make it rational for them to do so. A large fiscal crisis, a currency under pressure, a population with savings concentrated in regulated, accessible, domestically denominated accounts. You don't have to believe your government intends to confiscate anything. You only have to understand that every government that has done it believed at the time that it had no other option. Dmitry walked out of that bank in January 1948 with 10% of his savings. He didn't know the name of the mechanism. He didn't know it had happened before. In 1922, and would happen again in 1961. He knew his passbook showed a number that was different from the number he'd been building for a decade. He went back to the factory. He kept depositing. There was nowhere else to go. The Soviet state didn't steal from Dmitry because it was evil. It stole from him because he was accessible, his savings were liquid, and the mechanism was already built. The question worth asking, before the moment of crisis rather than during it, is whether the same description applies to you. History already taught you this. Nobody showed you the receipt. If you want to keep reading the receipts, we perform economic autopsies here so you don't become the next case study. Subscribe.